Coming to you from the world of AV control and programming, along with James King, I'm Steve Greenblatt, and this is Ask the Programmer. Hey, James, welcome back to another episode. Good to be here with you.
Thank you, Steve. This is definitely great to be back. Looking forward to this topic.
I think we're going to be talking about something that's going to really hit home with a lot of people, and in this case, we're going to do things a little bit differently because it's going to be geared toward those looking to develop and hire and also train programmers. So we're going to be talking about training resources. But before we begin, we wanted to give a shout out to a couple of people who've left us messages on LinkedIn. One is Sean Bergman from Foxglove Labs. Thanks, Sean, for reaching out and connecting. And another one is Joe Acully. I hope that I pronounced that right, from Root Integrated Systems. Thanks, Joe, for reaching out. James and I both appreciate it, and it's good to connect with you guys and really appreciate you listening as well as all the others. But this hopefully is some encouragement for us to connect with more listeners and hear what everybody has to say, because this show is driven by feedback. So, James, let's kind of jump right in to this topic of training, and I think it's a little bit of a murky one because there's I think a big myth that our AV industry really is kind of run by the training available through manufacturers, and while I respect and value all the time and effort that manufacturers put into training, it's only one piece of the puzzle. And I have some experiences that I can share, but I kind of wanted to bring it over to you. We spoke a little bit about how your experience has been that you came into this industry with programming knowledge, and so how did training that you received help, and what was effective, and what do you think was needed some additional development or emphasis?
So this is a great topic. Like you said, there's everything under the sun for manufacturer training, and they're great resources to get the framework and the foundation of learning what their languages do. But as I mentioned in the one episode, is if you're actually not programming and writing code, you're not going to learn it. You also have to have a project in mind. You got to come in going, this is what my end goal is. This is my project. This is what I got to learn. And I think that really benefited me going to training. I mean, a quick story, I was sitting there in a training class asking questions because I had a project even before going to training. There was something in my mind I wanted to do at our university. I'm like, I want to do this. I want to figure out how to do it. So I was asking the instructor questions. Now I was in a level one programming class. He was answering them, great instructor. And he's like, I think it was early June when I was doing this. He's like, you might be good for our programming 2 course in August. And I'm like, oh, if anyone know higher education, August is, you're not getting us. That's our busy time. So I'm like, oh, I don't think I can make August, but I'll see what my supervisor allows. Someone else in the classroom shut up and goes, oh, our boss won't send us to training that quickly. And the instructor looked at him and go, we recommend a year of training under your belt of programming 1 before programming 2. He's already asking programming 2 questions. So he's ready. And I think that I came in prepared. In fact, even the guy sitting next to me, I kind of joked with him because the first day of class, when we weren't around, he was only there because his boss wanted him to learn programming so they didn't have to hire a third party programmer. And the day of the last class, when you take the certification test, the guy walked in the room and goes, I fail me now, I told my boss, I don't care how much it costs, pay the programmers whatever they want. 'Cause this is too, he uses a split the word, hard. I looked at him, I go, pay me. Like, this is easy. Um, but again, I stayed with my university anyway. So, because it's a great place to work. But yeah, that's my take is you got to come in, you got to put work in. You're not going to learn it coming in knowing nothing.
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point with regard to having a project in mind or having a task in mind. I guess the question that I'll bring up, because this is where I think there's a little bit of struggle, is that I think that the manufacturer training tends to be very broad. So they don't necessarily know, like to your point, who's going to be in their class, what are the levels, how quickly are people going to pick stuff up, and what is it that everybody's trying to get out of the class. So um, I think that you came in with a big advantage, clearly,
Yeah.
and not only with the advantage because you had the background, but also because you had a goal in mind, and I think that there's probably a number of people who were in the person's shoes that said, pay somebody else because this is too hard, because they were probably just thrown right into the deep end. And I think that that could be really difficult and intimidating, but that doesn't mean that that person couldn't succeed. They just, they were lacking probably the fundamentals and a little bit of the almost the prerequisites that are unwritten.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this on the first episode that we did is programmers are a unique breed. We think differently. Um, so it takes some time to actually process the information that we're working on. I mean, there's time I'll be stuck in my code and I'll walk out of my office and my coworker, who's very good in his field, a little lax on the coding side, he'll look at me like, "Oh, what's going on?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm stuck on this problem." And he'll be like, "Oh, maybe I can help." And I'll start telling him, and eyes glass over. He doesn't know programming, and he's like, "Oh yeah." I was like, "I'll figure it out. Just let me go for a walk. I'll figure it out." And I do. I come back and figure it out. But you got to have that mindset, and not everyone does. And so programming is not for everyone. You can't just take your best installer and make them a programmer. And I feel that is done too quickly in the AV world. Is they take their best installer and make them a programmer, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
So somebody told me about that a while back, and this also goes back to I think our second episode where we were talking about the characteristics that make a good programmer. I think there's a little bit of a different approach in responsibility and also in the mode of thinking between somebody who is really good as an installer and a programmer, because I think an installer is hyper focused on doing one skill, one task at a time per se. And granted, if you're managing people, then that changes. But a programmer is constantly thinking about all the what if cases and what are the periphery things that may go wrong, or what needs to be considered in trying to find out the solution or solve a particular problem, or how do I code something in a way that this is going to be expandable, or this is going to be a good foundation for the future.
Yeah, and that goes again with the whole different mindset. Like you said, installers, nothing against them. They're great. I actually install stuff myself. And like you said, you're focused. It's you're taking this piece of hardware, you're putting it in. It's either a 2U, 1U, 5U, whatever. You're screwing it in. You use this connector, use that connector. Boom, bang, done. Programming is you got to think about all scenarios. You can sit here and go, okay, this button clicks and turns on the display. For most people, that might sound very simple. What you also got to say is, what is a user going to do? Are they going to come in and use two fingers? Are they going to come in and punch the button? Are they going to come in and, hit on the edge of the button, wanting it to work instead of the center of the button? So you got to throw in all cases, all scenarios, and trying to figure out what the users are going to do. Because you can sit here in a program and go, I know this button does this by clicking the center of the button. That's great. But does your user know that by looking at your interface? And that's another thing, is we have to be able to understand that and get that across our users. Is, for example, I know for me was when I had the button that says on, to me, that meant was when I see the word on, I want to turn the display on. Some of my users thought that meant the display was already on. So we had to work out to figure out what was the best terminology to use. Um, so again, it's a lot more variables that programmers have to be mindful of.
So the idea that we're just thinking about how to write code is really a fallacy, is what it sounds like. And if we're trying to target this toward people that are looking to either manage or groom or hire or try to bring programmers onto a team, um, how do they find those types of resources? Because that a lot of that is tribal knowledge that you have to really kind of get by being on the inside, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably the hardest thing. Is you're not going to have someone, especially if you're looking to hire, coming in knowing that tribal knowledge. But the person needs to be flexible. So that, like you say, is you got to be able to adapt to the variable that you're working with. Just so, like in programming, if you're throwing a value at a variable, that variable is changing. And us as programmers, we need to be able to adapt and think like that. And that's where the training comes into play. Is, as a manager or supervisor looking to get a programmer, you should have a understanding of programming. You're not going to know the ins and outs and all the tribal knowledge. But if you don't know the framework, how do you know your programmer knows the framework?
Right, that's a really good point. I was fortunate to never be that guy on an island. However, I know that term and I agree. And what I say is that you can't exist in this industry in a bubble, but it's very, same analogy. So having a mentor and having somebody that can be like your programming buddy, let's call them, or a coach, or just a trusted resource, really kind of sounds like a good way to bring somebody new into the industry or bring somebody up in the ranks. Is they really need to, it almost needs to be like an apprenticeship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I find that a lot. Is almost every area of AV is like that. And why should programming be different? I mean, you got tribal knowledge, you got the hand me down, the mentorship of, how to rig lights or how to set up your stage lights, how to install the equipment. Like, there's all that mentorship already. And why should we treat programming any different? Um, we definitely should have the tribal knowledge, people to learn from, other code to look at and be going. Like I said, I've looked at the old programmers' code and be like, this does that. I may not agree with it, roll it out, and then I find out, okay, he did this for X, Y, and Z. We no longer need that. Then we can adjust it, or we still need it. Let's continue it.
Well, one of the things, if I just want to kind of brainstorm a little bit about different ways that somebody can get started, and with regard to training that's informal, is going back to the idea of finding something that interests you and playing with it, that's centered around writing code. Hopefully it has something to do with the AV industry, but if it doesn't, it's still a matter of learning that mode of thinking. The other thing, though, that I found to be very useful too, because um, what we do kind of breaks into two pieces. You have the user interface side, which you had mentioned, and you also have the back end code. But being able to design a user interface that is a good quality, and is well thought out, and is aesthetically pleasing is definitely an area that doesn't really get touched as much in manufacturer training. So that's one thing. But then being able to simply take that user interface and write a scope around it. So here's what I plan to program. So if you can go and detail that and document it, then learning syntax, you're now narrowing down what is it that you really, what is the skill that you need help with. But if and some of these you can do without actually being trained in a particular language or technology, let's say.
I 100% agree. I think almost a good way you can look at it is for someone who's starting out to learn is thinking about it as when you were in school and they taught you how to do a paper. You always start with the outline first.
Hmm.
Think of your control interface as like your outline. You just throw something on there, it very broad. This is what it's going to do, and then you start drilling down and fine tuning it, and you make your adjustments as you go. You start with huge, big, broad, and you narrow it down.
I think in the end, what a lot of what we're saying is patience, and
Yes,
also it requires an investment on both parts. It involves a supportive environment and having a manager or a boss that understands that this is a process, but it also it involves the effort that's being put in on the side to be able to, hey, I know I want to do this, so what do I have to take on myself to be able to learn? And then I think going to training probably reinforces a lot of these principles. And I still like the idea too of having a project in mind, because if you can't apply what you're learning, then it's really not going to stick with you for too long.
100%. I think you as a programmer need to put the work in. Um, 'Cause it's a you guys think of it as it's not for your business, it's for you. You're building your skill set. Your business that you're working for is using that skill set, but you actually built your own toolbox and you can take that with you. Um, so you got to put the investment in. You have to put the time in. Like I mentioned on a couple episodes ago, I built a Raspberry Pi where I'm teaching myself programming stuff that I don't have formal training on now. And I'm learning and building from it. Eh, What Raspberry Pi these days are like $35. It's a small investment, and I gave myself a project. It's actually I've changed a couple times. It first started out as a controller for my aquarium. I used to run a saltwater tank. I had outlets I was turning on and off. I had lights I was turning on and off. So it started small, built up like that, and now I'm redo it, and it's completely different now.
I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap. And what else, let's see if we can take a poll, see what the audience thinks about how they have been able to evolve their skills and what value they see in training. But also, if you have any cool side projects that you've worked on, why don't you share those, and we'll talk about them in the future. But that'd be a cool thing to showcase. Um, James, how can people get in touch with you, and any parting words that you wanted to share?
No, this was a great topic, and again, you can reach me at Twitter, AV_James King, LinkedIn, higheredav.com, digital magazine with the IT and AV column.
And for me, Steve Greenblatt, I'm simply at Steve Greenblatt on social media, and look forward to hearing from you and connecting. So until next time, this has been Ask the Programmer.